Hi, welcome. In this podcast, we talk B2B marketing and what it takes to know your customer, innovate, and profit. We're glad you made it. This is The Campaign by 97th Floor. Happy Friday and welcome to episode 5 of The Campaign, a B2B marketing podcast about better knowing your audience, innovating beyond best practice, and converting visitors into customers. The Campaign is a weekly conversation with B2B marketing leaders designed to fit as much value as possible in 30 minutes. You can catch The Campaign live on Fridays at 2 Eastern, and you can find episodes on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and at 97floor.com. I'm Paxton Gray, CEO here at 97th Floor, and this week we are diving into all things case studies. B2B buyers are relying on content to inform their purchases more than ever before. 80% actually of B2B buyers reference case studies as part of their research. It's one of the most important elements and buying signals, an indicator of purchase behavior that we have in the B2B world. Case studies are a low cost and highly scalable way to build credibility and authority, support sales, differentiate your brand, personalize content to specific industries or personas, and increase conversions. There's some research actually from the Content Marketing Institute that says 73% of B2B marketers use case studies because they see significant improvement in lead generation and overall engagement by showcasing real world applications and successes. And to be honest, I'm surprised that that's that low. 73%, I'd imagine it'd be closer to 100%, especially in the B2B space. So all of this potential is lost, however, if we don't have strong infrastructure for sourcing and building these case studies, which makes me excited to bring on our guest today, Joel Klettke. He says that a lack of infrastructure is the number one barrier to case study creation. Joel is a sought-after consultant, veteran copywriter, and accidental entrepreneur. He built and sold Case Study Buddy, a boutique agency trusted by Zoom, Meta, and Shopify to help them capture, share, and turn customer stories into revenue. These days, he's advising B2B brands on conversion and customer marketing while building Calm Dads, a newsletter and podcast that helps fathers become the productive, proactive, and positive parents they want to be. I'll also add, Joel is someone who is a excellent follow on social media. There are maybe 3 people that I would say are excellent follows, and Joel is one of them. He's also a giver. Joel shares so much of what he's learned. I have called Joel personally for advice over the years, and he has spent some time, sat down with me, and helped walk me through some things. He just is the best plaid wearer that you could ever know. So, Joel, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me on. What an intro. That was very kind of you. I'm excited to dig into this in the time that we've got.
So, Joel, one thing that I've learned in my time working in marketing is that when you say case study, it conjures many different things for many different people, both in format as well as form. So for this conversation, let's nail down like what you mean when you say case study, or how you think you should be thinking about that.
Yeah, I actually don't love the words case study because I think it's a bit dated, and I think it's become so diluted from the academic world, and it conjures up this bias of like, oh, well, there's this one very specific format. I think most people just think of, well, of course, it's problem, solution, results, and then they fill in the blanks mentally from there. It should be X number of words and that sort of thing. So what I'm talking about and the language that I think we want to start moving towards is customer story. And the great thing about that is that can be an umbrella term for taking these customer experiences and delivering them in formats tailored to channels. So a customer story for your website might look like that deep dive 1,500 word piece. A customer story for your sales team might look more like a one sheet and something very concise and suited to that environment. A customer story might also be repurposed for somewhere like social or for ads. So when I talk about case studies, when we use that word for the sake of this call, what we're really talking about is a customer story with the customer at the center that captures their experience and highlights their trajectory of transformation in working with you. That might look different ways, might be expressed in different ways, but that is the heart of what we're really talking about here.
So when you say that the lack of infrastructure is the number one barrier, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, it never ceased to amaze me. It almost didn't matter what kind of company we engaged with, big, small, multi-billion dollar, mid six figures. Like most companies didn't have dedicated programs, clear accountability. It wasn't obvious who owned the process of customer stories. Most often these would be relegated to marketing. They'd say, hey, can you produce some customer stories? And that's kind of like telling one person on a basketball team, like, hey, can you go just go do a dunk? Like the rest of the team should be doing things to facilitate that. You can't run a play as one person on a team. But most companies don't have the infrastructure to facilitate that. They don't have SOPs. They don't have templates. They don't have things clearly mapping out accountabilities and the role that customer success or sales or leadership or marketing even play. And so it's this Hail Mary where it becomes this task instead of the byproduct of a process. And that's what the top 1% of companies that we worked with during my time at Case Study Buddy did differently is they had underlying process and systems that made customer stories inevitable, that made these a byproduct of the relationship rather than a task that you would hand to some intern and say, hey, go run the play on your own. And so when I talk about a lack of infrastructure, that's really it. We're leaving it up to marketers to just figure this out and stumble through. And the difference that it made, for example, working with HubSpot, the difference between the years that they had a dedicated SOP that we had access to see what the strategies were, the accountabilities, the documented process, and the years that we didn't, was night and day in terms of how effective we could be, how effective the storytelling could be. And most companies just aren't there. This is such an afterthought. This is such a reactive thing.
Mm. So most of the people listening to this show are marketing leaders who have been tasked with the job of case studies, and they may be in organizations where they don't have that infrastructure. What would you say to them? What is their first step within this to either build that infrastructure or deal with the lack of it in order to get this job done?
Yeah, I think you have to start with where you're at. You can't eat the whale. You can't suddenly snap to a reality where everyone's collaborating and everything exists. But one of the easiest ways to get started is to start putting together an SOP. Start putting together, this is the process we go through to produce customer stories. And as you do that, open up lines of dialogue to these other teams and say, hey, we're designing the process around how customer stories happen. We'd like you to have a voice in that process. We'd like you to have a say in how this happens. And what's really magical about that is it's notoriously difficult to get sales involved in nominating candidates and diverting from their workflow to even make the ask. There's all kinds of disagreement into when to make the ask. But when you can move proactively to sales or to another team, say, we are designing and formalizing a process around this. We want to make sure that what comes out the other side of it doesn't just serve marketing, but that what we produce serves you, so that when you ask us for a reference, we can go, we've got it, or here's why we're not doing that right now, or here's how we'll plan for that. It unlocks a lot of doors. And so one of the simplest things to do is just commit to documenting and putting together an SOP and to start that process and use that to open lines of dialogue. I think the second thing is to start thinking about customer stories not as this boilerplate thing that we started with, where it's just problem, solution, results, how hard can it be, but to treat them like we do every other content asset we create. No smart marketer sits down and goes, okay, I think I just need a blog post about anything. You've got to have some sort of overarching strategy that ties up and rolls up into business KPIs. That's why you're doing it. Otherwise, you're just making noise and bashing a keyboard. So one of the other steps that you can take is to start having discussions around what types of stories should we be telling this quarter or this year and why. And again, to make that practical, we did an entire year of stories with a company where the entire focus was not on their core offer. All we focused on was the new things they were able to offer through mergers and acquisitions, because their KPI, their needle they're trying to move is, hey, existing customers don't know these things exist. They're not adopting them. We know that if they do, we can sell a higher premium, tier plan. We did other entire quarters where we focused on what we call switcher stories, where you deliberately target customers who have switched from a specific competitor. You capture those stories and you tell them in that way. We did another, push where we did what we call disambiguation stories, where if your company is moving into a new market or into a new type of offering, or if you're serving a new sort of buyer and you need to bring what you do down into their language, their needs, focusing on telling stories that disambiguate how what you do benefits them, that can be very powerful. So start with an SOP, use that to open up lines of dialogues, and then collaborate on having an actual strategy for what you're creating, who that means you're approaching, and why that is. Tie it up into business KPIs, especially if you want leadership to care. If
Yeah.
you want them to be invested in enabling, you need to show them that there's a plan.
Interesting. We see a lot other orgs. Their case study strategy is almost dictated by the current needs of the sales team. The sales team would say, I need an example of this, or I need testimony from somebody in this space, or some specific need, and then marketing will go and look for that or build that. But what you're saying is, don't start there. Start with, what is the message we're trying to communicate? What is the goal as an organization we're trying to get to? And then say, if that is the message, what stories do we need to tell? And then that's what you're going and building, rather than being so reactive to whatever the need is on a Wednesday. You're building out your long-term campaign. Would you say that's accurate?
For sure. I think when you have a reactive strategy, you are constantly behind the ball. You're constantly chasing. You're constantly having to surface and go back into the archives and try to find stories rather than proactively nurturing and fostering and making these stories inevitable so that they're just a natural byproduct of a relationship. And what happens when you wind up in that place is you can never get ahead. No one's really getting what they want. The stories that you tell are going to be based on the whims, and sales is not really going to be satisfied because these stories are not fast. These assets are not quick. Like, coming from someone who ran a company that produced over 3,000 of the things, there are so many variables inherent in getting these done that to think that you can just snap your fingers and have a story by next week is foolish. And so rather than constantly react, this is what I'm saying, proactively tell your teams, we're building out the process for this. We want to involve you. And part of that discussion can be, what are the objections you're hearing most often? What are your goals for the quarter, for the year? Where are you struggling? Because rather than, constantly reacting to every new thing that they might need, start with the commonality, start with the huge areas of overlap. Once you've got a foundation to build on, once you've got underlying processes, once people know where and how and when they can contribute to this overarching process, then it's much easier that when you do need something in a reactive way, at least there's some proactive process to support that. But if everything you're doing is, we need this, can you do this? Not only are you constantly having to try to surface and find this, trying to get permissions, trying to identify who might even be willing to go on the record, and then trying to go through all the approvals, you're constantly going to be chasing. And so again, that top 1% of companies out of the 300 plus, 350 plus that we worked with, what they did so well was treat this as a proactive process, not a reactive asset. So building that foundation is critical.
I love that. Something that I've seen within orgs is, what I'd love to talk about is a cap on the amount of use that a case study or case studies can provide or customer stories can provide. And what I mean by that is, a sales rep, if we're just going to isolate this to sales, has a certain capacity for the number of case studies that they can familiarize themselves with and that they can use when needed. Theoretically, if you have 1,000 case studies, there's no way they can understand all of them and use all of them. What ends up happening, and I've seen it over and over again, is they will get their favorite 5 stories and they'll use those, and that's it. And so what do you recommend to organizations in terms of thinking about quantity of these stories? Because some of them, I think, spin their wheels thinking they need to build 200 of these, when really they could focus on fewer but better stories. And then is there also some factor of, this one story can be used in multiple scenarios and just needs to be reframed? And so it's kind of the one story, but we don't need to go find 5 different stories. This one story can fit 5 different scenarios. How should brands be thinking about that?
I think there is a bit of a challenge, because what happens is companies will get their 5 favorite stories and then let them stagnate, and they'll be like, our job is done. Next thing you know, you look up, it's been 5 years and your stories don't reflect your audience, the current state of the market, the objections people have, how you're being compared. And so it is this balance between, no, we don't need to get paralyzed by thinking that we need to have 200 stories out of the gate. Yes, we should be prioritizing these high priority, high impact stories that will have utility across a lot of areas. But we can't just get those and then go, well, our job is done. I think it's easy to forget that in a lot of cases and spaces, there is power in numbers. If you can show a financial institution as a cybersecurity company that, hey, we have stories on 30 different financial institutions, you don't even have to cite every single one, just by nature being able to point to those. That's a selling point. But I think a few things. Number one, you pointed to this, but when you're capturing a story, you want to begin with the end in mind. And the end in this case is the utility of that story. Where, how, when do we want to be able to use this? Because as I mentioned earlier in our conversation here, the tools and assets sales needs are very, very different at times from what marketing needs. And that's why there can often be this rift, because marketing is producing often these long form pieces or these really high profile videos, when sales is like, I can't use that. I can't bring that up on a call and read it line for line. I need Cliff's notes. I need one sheets. I need nuclear decks, compendiums of different things. And so starting from the lens of, okay, when we go to tell a story, number one, let's have a plan for where and how it will be used. But let's also, not just where possible, talk to one person on the client side, capture the story through one lens, and call it a day. If you are trying to influence a CEO, they will care about different things than a CMO or a CTO. And so can you, for example, capture that same story through multiple perspectives, that when your sales team or when your marketing team goes to reach that particular person in the buying chain, they can tell it in a different ways. Like for years, we've been told, well, just get one advocate because these are hard enough to do already. But if you can get to a place of being proactive, and when you're putting the story together, consider multiple perspectives, it's just more fuel for the fire that you can go and use later. So I think, yes, like prioritize your high impact stories, your stories with the most utility, but don't call it a day at that point. The reason that I am an advocate for continuing to produce stories, continuing to produce in bulk, I don't think we have to resign ourselves to the idea that, well, they're only going to fall back on their 5. They're only ever going to reference those. I think there are tools and there are ways that we can help our sales teams, our leadership teams. We can help them quickly surface the most relevant story. And more importantly, we can help our clients direct themselves to the most relevant stories. Like one of the things I hate to see is you go to a site, you see they have customer stories on the site, there's no filtration at all. What are people going to do? Either click the biggest logo or click the thing in the top left 100% of the time. But that story might not be that relevant to them. And so the more granular and the more disparate the people you sell into, the more they care about, say, the particulars of their niche or the particulars of their requirements, the more stories you probably do need in order to show them like, yeah, we've considered this before. We've done this before. So it is a nuanced thing. You don't want quantity for quantity's sake. But again, this is where being proactive and prioritizing it first really makes a difference.
I feel like in the B2B space, case studies are particularly difficult when compared to B2C for a couple of reasons. One, I use this toothpaste and my teeth got whiter. There's no approval process with that. It's just sign this piece of paper and now I've got a customer testimonial. Versus needing buy-off regulation, whether or not they can even say that they have used your product or service. Any tips for navigating that and having a higher success rate of getting past all the hurdles and tape?
Yeah, I think number one, recognize that your success in the ask starts long before you make the ask. So while hindsight is 2020, some of the things that companies should be doing now is looking at how often do we engage with our customers about their ROI and about the impact at all. Like for a lot of companies, that conversation never comes up. It's surprising to see that once someone is onboarded, they're kind of left to their own devices to figure out, are we actually winning here? And so looking at, well, what checks and balances, what natural connection points can we start to foster conversations around how we're tracking, how we're doing, what ROI they're seeing, so that we can make talking about and sharing conversations about ROI normal. I think when you go to make the ask, one of the death knells is a generic email that basically amounts to, hey, will you do us a favor? One of, we have seen like small changes make a big difference, even the wording. The difference in response rate, positive response rate between an email that says, will you be in a case study, and an email that says, can we feature you, is remarkable. Those are two very different asks. So part of in making the ask is, can you be personal? Why are you asking them? What is it about your relationship that is worth talking about? Can you be specific? What is it you would like them to share? This is where you have to be in a place of being proactive. If you don't know the story, if you're hoping to just discover that during the interview, that's terrifying for both of you,
Yeah.
because you don't know what you're going to get and they don't know what they're allowed to share. And so when you can approach customers in a one-to-one way and be specific and say, these are the things specifically we'd like to talk about, that makes it much easier to agree to or disagree with a tangible ask. If it's open-ended, this person is sticking their neck out on an infinite blank check. If it's contained, they can say to legal, this is what they want to talk about, or PR or leadership, this is what they want to talk about. Are we comfortable with this or with these metrics? And now you can have a more productive dialogue around, yes, this, but not that, or no, we can't talk about, and this is why. And at least that gives you more insight than just a blanket, no, we don't want to take part in this. I think the other thing you want to do when you make this ask is to be very clear about what's involved. Oftentimes, again, we're asking them to write a blank check on their time. How much time will I have to spend? And will I have permission to review a draft? And how much will this take from me? And so when you make the ask, can you be intentional about saying, here's what's involved, a 30-minute interview, and nothing goes live without your approval. We introduce those two sentences on virtually every single ask. And again, positive response rates improve when people know this is not a blank check and we have some control. And then the next thing is, again, leveraging samples and examples. Show them that other people like them have taken part in this process. Show them what the output looks like. Give them confidence that if other people can trust you with their story, they can as well. And so I think it's partly culture and normalizing these discussions about ROI. It's partly how you approach and make the ask. And then the last thing that I will say is, often stories die on the table or don't make it through approval because they simply just take too long. When there's no accountability, when this is one of 10 priorities on your plate, velocity is everything with a customer story. If you can't produce it quickly, get in front of the customer quickly, get them to pass it on quickly, then this will shift down the priority ladder like it's just sliding down with no feet on the thing. So, those are some tips for getting some buy-in. And really the final thing I'll say is, don't be afraid to bring in people with clout, especially in enterprise relationships or government or sensitive spaces. Can you bring in your leadership? Can you bring in the influencers in your business and show that they're also part of this discussion? Having them be part of that ask or be privy to that ask can make a difference in people's willingness to take part as well.
It makes it a lot safer for them. Yeah, for sure. I love that. Those are some really solid takeaways. I do want to make sure we get as tactical as possible, which is so hard in 30 minutes. But you had mentioned a SOP, like creating a SOP to build that infrastructure if you don't have that. Is there either a framework or a place you would send people to, hey, look at this as a template? Or is there a general framework that they might follow as they build out their first SOP to build this infrastructure for customer stories?
Yeah, I hate that this is my answer, because a lot of the times when we were dealing with specific documentation, was their documentation was an NDA. But the things that I can tell you tactically should be included that often get overlooked. These are some of the things that I would make sure that you're baking in. Number one is, again, have an actual table of the accountabilities, the steps in the process, who is accountable, what are the dependencies, and what is the targeted timeline. And everyone should know that and be on the same page there. I think the second really critical thing to include, and this sounds head smackingly obvious, but it makes a world of difference because it almost never happens, is align on some mutually agreeable criteria for what constitutes a win. Because otherwise the response from other teams is going to be, well, they're just about to renew, or the results will be better next quarter, or this or that. Have set criteria for what constitutes a win to eliminate internal friction. I think the other things you want to have in an SOP like this, you want to have templates for how the ask is made, templates for how you communicate once the ask has been made, templates for the actual formats that you're going to deliver and why those formats are that way. Having that in place makes it that much easier for, again, reducing internal friction. Other teams can see, oh, here's how they'll be communicating. Here's how I can make the ask so I don't even have to really think about it. I can just personalize this. Here's the stories that will come out the other side. You also want to have in that SOP document, I think you want to have an explicitly documented and constantly updated. Here is our strategy for X period. These are the stories we are prioritizing right now. That might be one batch of stories. That might be 3 different topics. That might be something you revisit quarterly or biannually or annually. But again, the goal of this document has to be to make it abundantly clear, not only here's how we do things, here's who's involved, here's what your roles, tasks, and dependencies are as you do this. Here's how we're going to make it easier for you to do that job. Here's the criteria that we can align behind for what constitutes a win. And here are some great examples that we can point to. If at a bare minimum, that is the rough like framework, or if you only included those things, you'd still have a better SOP than 99% of companies, because 99% of companies don't have one at all. So those are what I would call the core components. There's other things you can bring in, but if nothing else, take those things I just listed off and start there. That's as good a place as any to launch with.
Do you, the format of a case study can be very widely. We could be a PDF downloadable, it could be long, it could be a landing page or a video. Do you recommend that brands focus on gathering the stories and the information, and then they think about format? Or are those two things, should they be the same? And then if they're not the same, how do you recommend companies like store that information to be used then in different formats and repurpose?
I think you have to, particularly when it comes to video can never be an afterthought, because the thing you want to avoid is duplication of effort for your client. It's really, really annoying for a customer to get on a call for a written story and then have to separately show up for a video. And so that's where, again, beginning with the end in mind, where you have a distribution plan from the start, you have some sense of, okay, we want to be able to use this on social, on the site, in our warm up and nurturing sequences, and detailing out, okay, what do we need to make that happen? The way that we tended to think about it as Case Study Buddy is we always were aiming to capture the core story. And then we were always, increasingly, I would say this is the trend line. Video is always part of the ask, unless you know for sure it's going to get shot out of the sky. It's okay if they refuse it. I would much rather have the story in any format than not have video at all. So if you're in a place where like no one's going to get in front of a camera, or almost nobody, like cybersecurity or highly sensitive space is okay, navigate this a little bit differently. But I think you want to plan for the most, and then scalpel that down as you have to. It's come to the table with your biggest ask, and then that gives you some negotiating power. But beyond anything, I think once you've captured that core story, and this is a hard realization for a lot of teams too, but your story will only ever be as good as your interview. So your interviewer better be really, really, really good at what they do, because you don't get a mulligan on that stuff. But focus on, okay, capture as much information as we can in as tight a window as possible. You can get everything you need for every format you need in 45 minutes or less on a call. I'm convinced of that. Capture the core story, then you can express it in different ways. Often, if you can get them to approve the longest form version of what you want to do, maybe that's your 1,500 word piece, because they've approved that, now you have a big corpus of approved content that you can spin out into these other use cases without having to trot it back to them
Just
over and
inherent
over.
in the approval of the bigger asset. Yeah. I think that's
because
great.
they've said yes to these quotes, yes to these stats, yes to this narrative. So you don't have to go back to the well every single time. So can we use it? So start with the biggest ask, capture the biggest story, produce the biggest asset, get approval for that thing. And then now you should have some leeway in repurposing.
To wrap, I'd love to share my take and get your reaction to it. And that is, we're living in a time where there's more uncertainty, economically speaking, and brands are struggling more and more to acquire customers. And in light of that, customer stories are the number one thing that marketers should be working on and thinking about. However, they often end up being the number 4 or number 5 thing. But honestly, I feel like if you put that in the number 1 spot, like I don't think there's anything that trumps customer stories, especially in a time where uncertainty is so high and buyers want more. They want to be able to paint the picture of how your solution is going to get me to where I want to go. Customer stories are the way to do that. And so I think the way forward, especially right now, is focusing number 1 on customer stories.
Yeah. People love to dunk on case studies like, I don't read them, I don't trust them, they're all cherry picked stats. I think you're absolutely right. Like, we are in a period where buyers demand proof. They are risk averse. Everything right now feels like a risky bet. And so being able to do it well, I think that's the important thing. A poorly told customer story benefits nobody. If you tell the story in a way that's not believable, if you tell the story through a lens of hyperbole, if you don't put the customer at the center of it and it reads like a gigantic back pat with no validation from a real human being who worked with you, don't bother. Like, those are the types of things where that's not doing the thing. That's not going to move the needle like you want it to. The companies who are going to win are going to be the companies who realize, hey, they can steal our features, they can poach our people, they can, copy our design, they can, mimic our messaging. The one thing they can't take away from us that are ours to lose are our advocates, our customer stories. And so I think leaning into customer marketing and advocacy as a whole is a huge, tremendous advantage. And customer stories are a critical part of that, as long as you're doing them transparently and you're doing them well. I think they make all the difference in the world. And I think as part of a marketing mix, they're dramatically underappreciated, especially in this climate of wanting to do more with less. People publish these things once and forget about them. And it's like driving, a Ferrari only on Sundays. Like, you bought the thing, you made the investment, use it. And that's the part that grieves me most, I think, is people not seeing the forest for the trees. These can help across the entire buyer's journey. And you should be using them that way.
So many cases where it's just like, hey, just squeeze a little bit harder and you'll get so much more juice out of that orange. Just like you were saying, you get one champion, you get one person to say yes to this. Keep going. Ask more people within that same organization. You can get so much more benefit, but it's like you run this long race just to stop right at the finish line and not just keep going all the way through and get more benefit. I love that. Joel, thank you so much for joining us today. I have some takeaways that I want to list out. One, asking customers, can we feature you, instead of saying, hey, can you do us a favor? It's going to be much more effective. I think it's a great takeaway. Be clear with them about what is expected of them and what's involved in this. Also love the idea of bringing in influencers or other leaders to help validate and help them feel safe that this is, this is an okay thing to do, to be involved in this story. Normalize conversations around ROI and set agreements about what is a win. I mean, that's just, great practice even outside of customer stories. And then lean into customer advocacy, especially right now, but as long as you do it transparently and as long as you do it well. So some solid takeaways, I think, for our listeners. Thank you so much, Joel, for joining. I'd love to have you back to talk more about this, because I think we only scratched the surface, and there's so much more I'm sure you could share with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the chance to share.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. That's been everything for the campaign. Tune in Fridays at 2 Eastern. You can watch this again on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, or at 97floor.com. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for listening. The campaign is produced by 97th Floor, a 20-year-old marketing agency that helps companies like McKinsey, Pluralsight, and Checkpoint know their customers, execute innovative campaigns, and drive profitable growth. If you have an allocated growth budget and product market fit, we'd love to do research and build a proposal for you. Visit us at 97thfloor.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe. See you next time.